What exactly are we doing when we understand something, or when we think? Are thinking and understanding the same thing, or are they two different things? Is it even possible to define them? And how will the way we define them affect the question of whether artificial intelligence can truly think and understand? Hello everybody, I'm Michael Augros. I teach at Thomas Aquinas College and my field is philosophy. Welcome to the third video in this 10-part series where we're tackling the big question, can artificial intelligence truly think and understand? In this video, we'll be digging into the questions I just raised. One goal here is to define think and understand clearly enough that our question about AI will take on definite meaning and become something we can actually approach and explore. A second goal is to introduce some key fundamentals from the cognitive philosophy of Thomas Aquinas, which will lay the foundation on which to build arguments in later videos. As luck would have it, we can tackle both goals at once, since the fundamentals we need from Aquinas are precisely his definitions, or at least key elements in his definitions, of cognitive terms like thinking and understanding. By getting a handle on what he says about these, we'll not only get the basics of his philosophy that we'll need later, but also sharpen and refine our own question about AI's ability to think and understand. By the end of this video, we'll have worked out the primary basics of Aquinas' cognitive philosophy from the ground up. That's a pretty tall order, so this episode runs a bit longer than some of the others in the series. I've chopped it into 10 bite-sized parts to make it easier to follow. At the start of each part, I'll put up a slide letting you know what's coming next, and that might be a good moment to pause, grab a snack, some coffee, or take a breather. But if you stick with it to the end, you'll be able to say you've seen how Aquinas derives his conclusions about the general nature of cognitive action, and how he carefully distinguishes both sensing and thinking from understanding. And once we've laid all that out, we'll circle back to our main question about artificial intelligence to see how everything we've learned from Aquinas helps to sharpen it. In the previous video, I explained how the material I intended to present might seem like an overwhelming cascade of technical details. But really it wasn't, since most of it was just meant to illustrate some general points about AI. Here I need to give almost the opposite heads up. The material in this video, drawn almost entirely from Aquinas' philosophy, might seem so general that you'll wonder how it could possibly matter for a discussion about AI. But the truth is, we'll be doing the hard groundwork here. The work that's essential for the later videos where we'll put together Thomistic arguments to show why LLMs and other AI systems cannot truly think or understand. And while I'm going to do my best to keep it clear and easy to follow, I can't change the fact that Aquinas' philosophy is serious stuff. So buckle up, this is not Aquinas for dummies, Aquinas for tourists, or Aquinas light. Nor is it Aquinas just for philosophers. It's Aquinas for anyone who wants to see the real thing and is willing to spend the time required. Our biggest goal in this video is to follow the insights of Aquinas in order to understand what knowing or cognition really is. But before we jump right into that, it's worth pausing to reflect on why, if we want to track down what knowing is, we need a philosopher and not just a dictionary. Hence this little introduction to the question. The word know is often used in contrast with words like believe, think, or suppose. I know something if I see it for myself. I believe it if I haven't seen it, but take someone's word for it. Or I might be said to know something if I'm sure it's true, with no possibility of error, whereas I just think it if it's my opinion, but I'm not entirely sure. But in this video, I won't be using know with those contrasts in mind. Instead, I'll be using it as a general label for any act of a cognitive power. For example, we say the sense of sight knows the visible features of things, the sense of touch knows tangible features, memory knows past events, imagination knows the qualities that we can sense, and the mind or intellect knows what things are or why they are the way they are. So seeing, feeling, hearing, remembering, imagining, understanding, all these are particular instances of some general kind of thing we call knowing. And it's this general notion of knowing that we want to define. Our question then is this: what is common to all these acts? What does it mean to know something? But to motivate a serious philosophical hunt for a definition, we need to see why this isn't just a matter of looking up the word in the dictionary. That's not always obvious, since dictionaries sometimes offer definitions that go beyond pure lexicographical meaning. They can include something essential, even scientific or philosophical. For example, if a dictionary tells us that water means a colorless, transparent, odorless, tasteless liquid that forms seas, lakes, rivers, and rain, it's doing its basic job, helping us recall what thing the word water refers to. But it hasn't told us what water is. For example, it hasn't told us the chemical composition that explains why water has all those properties. Nowadays, most dictionaries will mention that water is a compound made of 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom with covalent bonds, H2O. Here, the dictionary has ventured into saying something about water's essence or nature, since it's analyzed it into its elements. But even so, there are 2 reasons why a dictionary isn't a substitute for the science of chemistry when it comes to explaining the nature of water. First, even when it offers a chemical definition, the dictionary gives no evidence that this description truly applies to water. Nor does it explain why this description is more essential than, say, a list of sensible properties. To see for ourselves that water is indeed H2O, we need to perform experiments like electrolysis and detect the resulting hydrogen and oxygen. And to see that its chemical formula gives a more essential understanding of water than a mere qualitative description of it, we have to recognize that the formula explains the properties, not the other way around, and that a substance's material components are more fundamental to its nature than its surface features. Doing that means setting aside the dictionary and picking up chemistry. Second, the dictionary might not always bother to give the chemical nature of a substance in the first place. It doesn't always offer the more essential definition over and above the usage definition. And this isn't just a chemistry issue. It holds for mathematical objects, logical entities, physical realities, and yes, philosophical matters too. Because a dictionary's job is to clarify how a word is used in a language, it doesn't have to tell us how to analyze the thing it names into simpler concepts or more elementary things, or provide evidence that its analysis is correct. It often leans on synonyms or near synonyms, which isn't the same as identifying a thing's nature. And a dictionary definition can even involve some circularity, yet still do its job of familiarizing us with how a word is used. Knowing is a case in point. One of my favorite dictionaries on my shelf offers the following definitions of the verb know. Definition 1, recognize, perceive, identify, specifically perceive a thing or person as identical with something or someone already perceived or considered. Definition 2, be acquainted with a thing, a place, a person, be familiar with by experience or through information. Definition 3, be personally acquainted with a person, be familiar or friendly with. Definition 4, have sexual intercourse with, now archaic or jocular. I would add that it's also biblical. Definition 5, be aware or apprised of something, especially through observation, inquiry, or information. Definition 6, be conversant with a body of facts, principles, a method of action, etc., especially through instruction, study, or practice. Definition 7, have understanding or knowledge. Definition 8, comprehend as fact or truth, understand with clearness and certainty. Of these, number 5 probably comes closest to the meaning that we're interested in. Be aware or apprised of something, especially through observation, inquiry, or information. It's pretty general. But what does be aware mean? Well, the same dictionary tells us that aware means conscious, sensible, not ignorant, having knowledge of something, or that something is so. So to know means to be aware, and to be aware means to have knowledge. For a dictionary, that kind of circularity is fine, but for philosophy, it's not. We're interested in discovering what things can and what things cannot perform an act of knowing. Figuring out some of the causes behind having or lacking that power requires more than just listing synonyms for knowing. We need an analysis of knowing into more fundamental things or concepts. Saying being aware doesn't analyze knowing. It doesn't place it into a more fundamental category. A cat, for instance, is a type of mammal. But what type of thing is knowing? The dictionary doesn't tell us, since that's not really its job. A cat differs from other mammals by being an obligate carnivore, by purring, by having whiskers. But how does knowing differ from other things found together with it in the same general category? Again, the dictionary doesn't say. And yet knowing is a specific kind of thing in a broader category. It's a type of act or action that we perform. When I understand something, that's an act of knowing. When I remember what I ate for breakfast, that's also an act of knowing. When I see something, that's another. Seeing is a thing I'm actually doing when my eyes are open, but that I merely have the potential to do when my eyes are shut. Seeing is the actuality of that potential, and so seeing is some type of act or action. In general, knowing is some kind of action or act. But then how does this act called knowing differ from other acts that we perform, like desiring, hoping, regretting, walking, talking, writing, getting dressed, making dinner, or doing the dishes? That's not something we can answer without giving the matter some thought. In other words, we have to philosophize. And until we do, our grasp even of the general concept of what it means to know remains murky, indistinct, and lacks definition. The question, what does it mean to know, is very general, since knowing, as I'm using the term here, includes so many different varieties: seeing, hearing, smelling, imagining, remembering, understanding, and so on. Sight knows colors. Memory knows past events. The intellect knows what a triangle is, and so on. What is common to all these strikingly different things such that they all fall under the label of knowing? Universal questions are often difficult, and this one is no exception. It's also hard to get at because knowing is so natural to us. What we do naturally, automatically, and all the time doesn't easily reveal itself to us. Plus, knowing is a unique kind of thing. There's nothing quite like it. So even half-decent analogies are hard to come by. But don't worry, we're not going it alone. We'll enlist the help of Thomas Aquinas. With his guidance, we'll arrive at a proper definition in the later parts of this video. Our first step toward understanding Aquinas' general explanation of cognition is to get familiar with his terminology of acts, powers, and objects. Don't worry, it's not complicated. It's really just about acknowledging the labels he uses for things that all of us are familiar with already. We can start to get a feel for what he means by powers, their acts, and their objects just by looking at some examples. In this slide, you see some powers lined up alongside their corresponding acts and objects. The sense of hearing is a power. Hearing is the act it carries out, and the object is sound, something that can be heard. The capacity to desire is a power. Desiring is its act, and its object is a desirable thing. Object, act, power. You get the idea. A power isn't the same as an act. It's the standing capacity or ability to carry out an act. When I'm in a deep sleep, I'm not hearing anything, but I still have the ability to hear, and that ability comes back into operation when I wake up. So I possess the power of hearing, even when asleep, but I'm not performing the act. Likewise, when I'm sitting down, I'm not actually walking, but I still have the capacity to walk, the ability to get up and leave the room. So I have the power to move myself, which is different from the exercise of that power, the act of rising up from my chair and walking. So powers are not the same as their acts, they're abilities to perform those acts. But as a rule, powers are defined and distinguished by their corresponding acts. For example, the sense of hearing is the power to hear, that's its act. The sense of sight is the power to see, again, its act. And the difference between hearing and sight is just the difference between the kinds of acts that they make possible. Also, a power exists for the sake of its act. The ability to walk exists so we can walk. The ability to hear exists so we can hear. You get the picture. If no one cared about the act of walking, no one would care about having the power to walk either. Okay, so now what about objects? The first step in seeing what Aquinas means by an object, his Latin term is objectum, is realizing he doesn't mean what we usually mean today. Nowadays, when we say object, we tend to mean an inanimate thing. A coffee mug, for example, is an object in that sense. It's just an inanimate thing considered by itself without reference to anything else. But that's not what Aquinas means when he talks about the object of a power, act, or habit. For Aquinas, the object of the sense of sight means something that sight can see. And obviously that doesn't have to be inanimate. A cat is an object of sight, even though it's animate. And importantly, a cat isn't an object here just in itself, but in relation to the sense of sight. In other words, to be an object in Aquinas' sense is to be an object of something, namely of a power, of a habit, or of an act, Nothing is an object in an absolute sense, just floating out there being an object without some kind of relation. This means that one and the same thing can be an object in relation to one power, and at the same time not be an object for another power. Color is an object of sight, but not of hearing. Not all objects, in Aquinas' sense, are inanimate, and not all are animate, but they're all objects in relation to the powers of living things. I've been using human examples, powers like human sight, memory, and imagination, but all living things have powers, acts, and objects. A horse has the power to see, the power to gallop, the power to reproduce. An oak tree has the power to grow, to reproduce, to compartmentalize its wounds. So what defines an object here? What do all the things Aquinas calls objects have in common? They're the things that some power of a living thing is preoccupied with. For example, the objects of sight are the things that sight sees. The objects of anger are the things anger is directed toward. The objects of digestion are the things that get digested, or else the end products of digestion. The objects of healing are the tissues that are healed, or the end result of the healing process, and so on. Each of these things called objects either initiates the corresponding act, that it activates the power, or it's the result produced by the act. Visible things activate vision, so they're its objects. Healthy tissue is what healing produces, so that's the object of healing. Acts are similar to motions or changes in this respect. Motions or changes are defined by their termini, that is, by the things that start them going, or else by their end states. Heating, for example, can be defined either as a change caused by a hot thing acting on something else, or as a change that results in something becoming hot. Likewise, the acts we perform are defined and distinguished either by what starts them, their active causes, or by what they themselves produce, their results. And these are said to be the objects of those acts. If an act is initiated by something outside us, and that thing acts on us and changes us, and we don't act back on it, except maybe incidentally, then Aquinas says that thing is the object of our act, acting as a mover or activator in relation to it. For example, when I see something, the act begins with that visible thing acting on my eyes. My sight doesn't act on it just by seeing it. So that thing is the object of my act of seeing, in the sense that it activates or initiates my act. On the other hand, if an act is initiated by us, and by means of it we act upon something and change it, then the object is the thing we act on, or else it's the end result of our action upon it. For example, when I walk, I act on my own body and change its location. The new location is the object, the objective of my walking. It's an essential ingredient in what defines and distinguishes that act from other movements. So that wraps up Aquinas' terminology of powers, acts, and objects. Our next step toward understanding Aquinas' conception of knowing, or cognoscere, is to look at a general rule or principle that applies not just to knowing, but to all acts. In his own words, the rule goes like this: unum quodque agens agit secundum quod in actu est. Translated somewhat over literally, every agent acts insofar as it is in act. What this means is every agent acts by being actual in some way specifically relevant to its action. Actual here is contrasted with potential. For example, before any house is built, a pile of materials has the potential to be a house, but it's not actually a house yet. Once the house is built, those materials are now actually a house. Or before I open my eyes, I have the potential to see, but I'm not actually seeing. When I open them, I'm actually seeing. My power of sight is fully actual. So Aquinas' rule says that whatever acts must already be actual. And not just actual in whatever way, it must be actual in a special way, one that's relevant to the act that it performs. It must possess some actuality that's the basis of its action. For example, what heats something just by contact with it must itself be actually hot. Fire can heat water because the fire itself is actually hot. It couldn't heat anything if it were only potentially hot. Or a teacher can teach only if they actually know what they're teaching. A geometry teacher can't teach geometry by only potentially knowing it. They need to actually know it. Now, the agent doesn't always need to have exactly the same actuality that it produces. That happened to be true in the two examples I just gave, but it doesn't always have to be that way. Why? Well, first, not every agent acts on something else, as we'll see later. A cognitive agent acts mainly within itself. So in that case, there can be action without conferring actuality on another thing similar to the actuality that's within the agent. And second, sometimes the agent has a different kind of actuality from the new result it's capable of producing in something else. For example, when I build a house, I don't do it by actually being a house myself. I do it by having actual knowledge of house building and an actual desire to build. So while I don't need to be an actual house in order to produce one by my action, I still need a specific actuality relevant to house building. If I only had the potential to know how to build and no actual knowledge, I couldn't build anything. So the rule holds. What acts must always be actual in a way that enables it to act as it does. Another example, suppose I discover the Pythagorean theorem for myself without anyone teaching me. We might loosely say I taught myself the theorem. Strictly speaking, though, that's not true. Strictly, to teach means helping someone see something on the basis of one's own prior knowledge of it. So I can teach someone else the theorem because I already know it, but I can't teach myself the theorem because that would mean I already knew it before I knew it, which is impossible. But I can discover the theorem by reasoning. If I don't yet know the theorem, can I reach it purely from my potential to know? No, I need to actually know certain other things, like certain premises, from which I can reason. It's by actually knowing those premises that my mind can act, reason, and generate the new knowledge. So again, Aquinas' rule holds. I can't act so as to arrive at new knowledge without already being actual in some way. And, this is important, it's not just any prior knowledge that works. My knowledge has to be relevant. I can't reach the Pythagorean theorem just because I know the price of tea in China. There must always be some similarity between the actuality by which an agent acts and the actuality it produces. That similarity can be close, like knowledge of premises leading to knowledge of a conclusion, or it can be more general, even just analogous. But in every case, there must be some actuality in the agent that serves as the basis for its action, and that actuality must in some way resemble the result. So, the heat of the fire resembles the heat it produces in the water. The knowledge in the teacher resembles the knowledge to be produced in the student. My own prior knowledge resembles the new knowledge I'm able to generate in myself by reasoning on my own. Consequently, Aquinas' first rule about agents, that every agent acts by being somehow relevantly actual, leads to a second, closely related rule. Every agent produces something like itself, or in his Latin, omne agens agit sibi simile. Fire makes things hot like itself. Builders make houses like the ones they have in mind. Teachers produce knowledge in students like the knowledge they themselves have. By reasoning, I produce new knowledge in myself that's generally similar to the knowledge I already hold. So in summary, that's Aquinas' rule. Whatever acts must do so by virtue of some relevant actuality it already possesses, and its corollary, every agent produces something similar to itself in some way. If we now combine this with the fact that a knower is an agent and knowing is an action, we get a result. We can even frame it as a syllogism. So premise 1, every agent acts in virtue of being actual in some special way relevant to its action. Premise 2, every knower in knowing is an agent. Therefore, every knower in knowing acts in virtue of being actual in some special way relevant to its act of knowing. The first premise there is just Aquinas' general rule about agents. The second premise is the simple fact that knowing is a type of act, not just a dormant capacity or power. So, every knower knows by means of some actuality within the knower. Some actuality that's the active source of that specific act of knowing. Just as something hot heats by being actually hot, so too a knower knows by being actual in some particular way. If I'm actively seeing a horse, for example, that's because something actual in me at that moment enables me to see the horse. If I'm actively thinking about circles or squares, that's because something actual in me enables me to think about circles or squares. We'll apply this conclusion later as we work toward a definition of knowing, or cognoscere in Aquinas' Latin. So far, we've made two steps toward Aquinas' definition of what we're doing when we know. First, we got a handle on his language of objects, acts, and powers. Second, we noted his rule that every agent acts by being, in some special way, actual. Now we take the next step, familiarizing ourselves with Aquinas' distinction between motion and operation. In Latin, that's the distinction between motus and operatio. By motus, Aquinas didn't mean only locomotion or change of place, though that's included. He meant any continuous process. A horse galloping from point A to point B is a motus, but so is water going from cold to hot, a child growing, or water freezing into ice. Even though in English motion usually suggests change of location or position, I'll follow Thomistic custom and use motion, the English cognative motus, to mean what Aquinas meant, any continuous change or process from one state to another. Likewise, Thomists usually translate operatio by its English cognate operation. Now in English, that word might first make you think of surgery, or maybe a military maneuver, or even a mathematical operation. It can also mean an act that takes practice or training, like the operation of a motor vehicle. Once upon a time, operation simply meant any action or deed, and that's the sense closest to Aquinas' operatio. It's a bit obsolete today. Few people would call walking or talking an operation, but Aquinas used operatio for any kind of act, whether it involved motion or not, although he sometimes used it to mean specifically an act that is not a motion. And that's how I will be using it. So we'll be drawing a distinction between motion on the one hand and operation on the other. Aristotle, by the way, drew more or less the same distinction as Aquinas. Aquinas' distinction between motus and operatio, motion and operation, is fairly equivalent to Aristotle's distinction between kinesis and energeia. So what is Aquinas' distinction between motus, motion, and operatio, operation? Well, let's start with examples. Example of motion, walking home. Example of operation, wishing or desiring to be at home. Before we highlight the differences, notice what they have in common. Both walking and wishing can be called an act or action. We speak of the act of walking home versus the mere potential or power to walk, and also the act of desiring versus the mere capacity to desire. So motion is an act, and so is operation, but there are 4 important differences. Difference 1. Motion is the actuality of something imperfect or incomplete. If I'm walking home and I'm not yet home, my walk gradually brings me closer. While I'm walking, I'm in a state of becoming progressively more complete relative to being at home. I'm becoming closer to being at home. Likewise, if water is heating up, it's not yet as hot as it will be in a moment. The process moves it continuously nearer to some completed state. So motion is necessarily the act of a thing that's as yet incomplete, and in that sense imperfect, and due to be more actual than it is at present. By its nature, motion is the act of something unfinished, the act of a work in progress. By contrast, wishing to be at home doesn't mean I'm gradually becoming more at home or even gradually desiring to be there more. I can just sit still, desiring to be at home, without my continuously progressing in that act over time. In that sense, desire is the act of something already perfect, already complete in some way that makes the act possible. For example, I must already possess an idea of home, a memory of it, and some affection for it in order to wish for it. Only if I already have all these things can I perform the act, and in performing the act, I'm complete as someone wishing to be home. True, if I'm wishing to be at home, I'm in a sense imperfect or unfulfilled insofar as I'd like to be home and I'm not. Nonetheless, my act of desiring does not require me to go home in order to be a complete act of desire. It doesn't consist in or require me to be in any way progressing or becoming somehow more complete. I might never go home, and my desire itself might not be increasing, but staying fairly steady, and yet my act of desiring is a perfectly complete act of desiring. In that sense, desiring to be home isn't the act of someone who is somehow in progress, and thus is only imperfectly what he's soon going to be. Instead, it's the act of someone who already fully possesses all the prerequisites for desiring, and thus performs the act. Aquinas sums all this up. Motion and operation differ, because motion is the act of something imperfect, whereas operation is the act of something already perfect. That was difference 1 between motion and operation. Now difference 2. Motion is an inherently imperfect act. Now that sounds the same as the first difference, but it's slightly different. Not only is motion the act of an imperfect thing, that's the first difference, but it's itself an inherently imperfect act, the second difference. As long as I'm walking home, I haven't yet walked home. The moment I can say I have walked home, I'm no longer walking. Motion by its nature vanishes the instant it's complete. Moving to X and having moved to X cannot coexist. Operation is different. Suppose I spend 2 hours feeling homesick, wishing to be home. During hour 2, I'm still wishing, but it's also true that I have wished for the past hour. Same with other emotions. If you're angry with me for 2 hours, during hour 2, you're still angry, but you've also already been angry during hour 1. Emotions and desires endure as complete acts, not unfinished progressions. Aquinas sometimes mentions both distinctive characteristics of motion together. Motion, he says, is the act of something still being in potency, and so it's an imperfect act, and also an act of something imperfect. Connected with this difference between motion and operation is another difference in terms of the time they take. Unlike a motion, which takes a definite amount of time before it's done and can be spoken of as a complete act, an operation, such as wishing or being angry, can endure for just about any amount of time, long or short, and is complete throughout. That's not to deny that there can be something like stages in feeling angry or in feeling homesick and getting over it. But I can feel homesick or angry throughout an entire hour or day or year, or just for a minute. The time is indeterminate. Given a speed at which I'm walking home, the time it takes is determinate. And if I'm miles away from home, there's no way the whole motion can take just a minute. But I can complete a whole act of feeling homesick inside 1 minute. So a motion is a never complete act so long as it's still going on, while an operation is an always complete act for as long as it goes on. And it's in that way more like a state than like a progression. That was the second difference between the two. Difference 3 is that motion has no nature apart from its terminus. For example, the process called becoming a house does not have some nature of its own other than being a house. At any step along the way, it consists in nothing else than some imperfect version or part of being a house. Becoming hot is not something altogether foreign to being hot, the way being green is different from being hot. Instead, becoming hot just consists in an ordered continuum of being more and more hot. By contrast, operation can involve another nature besides that of its terminus or object. For example, wishing to be home is not an ordered continuum of being more and more at home. Being at home is a way of being in a place, whereas desiring is not a way of being in a place, not even an imperfect version of being in a place. And an act of wishing is characterized not only by what it's a wishing for, but also by the entity performing that act. Not just anything that can be in a new place can wish for it, but only what has a nature capable of wishing. So, the nature of an operation is not determined purely by its object, but also by the nature of the agent performing it. Thanks to this dual aspect of its nature, it does not always end up in the same category as its object, but fits somewhere in the various categories of being based on how it's related to the agent performing it. But motion has no nature over and above the states or ways of being that terminate it. As Aquinas put it, motion does not have any nature apart from other things. Instead, each form, when it's in the process of becoming, is the imperfect act which is called a motion. For example, moving toward whiteness is just whiteness beginning to actually come to be in a subject. So much for difference 3. Difference 4 is that motion necessarily involves departure from something. Operation does not. Motion is not only toward some object or in some direction, but is also away from something. Every motion is in that sense a departure from some state or condition. If X is contrary to Y, then becoming X by means of some motion means losing Y. Walking from one end of a room means getting farther from the starting point. Heating up means no longer being cold. Turning from green to red means no longer being green. Sometimes all that a motion leaves behind is some sort of privation, but nonetheless it has to be left behind. For instance, not everything that takes on a new color has to leave behind some previous color it had, since maybe it was purely transparent instead. Even so, it has to lose its pure transparency if it's to take on a new color. And whatever becomes healthy must leave behind illness or injury. Every motion thus requires not only a new acquisition of some sort, but also a loss of some previous condition, even if that condition was privative. That's untrue of operation. While moving toward health requires a loss of illness, wishing for health does not require a loss of illness. I can wish for health all I want and remain ill or even get sicker. I can also hate illness all I want and remain ill. I can hope for riches all I want and remain poor. True, I can't delight in riches while remaining poor, since delighting in something implies possession of it, but even in that case, delighting in riches does not imply the loss of previous poverty. I might delight in riches even though I was born rich. Only if I become rich after being poor do I have to leave poverty behind, and becoming rich is not an operation, but something more like motion. So, every motion requires the loss of some previous condition contrary to the object or terminus of the motion, whereas operation does not require the loss of anything contrary to its object. Now a similar but slightly distinct difference. Every operation as such fulfills or actualizes a natural power or capacity in the operator, whereas that's not true of any motion just as a motion, and there are some motions of which it simply isn't true. My becoming ill is not the fulfillment of a natural capacity in me. True, I'm able to be made ill, but that's not because I have any natural need to become ill, but more because my immune system has fallen down on the job. I don't have a getting sick system that's fulfilled by my getting sick. By contrast, my feeling sad about being ill, which is an operation rather than a motion, is the activation, use, exercise, or fulfillment of a natural capacity I have for feeling sad. And there is something good about that feeling, if it's reasonable and appropriate. Feeling sad is not just a negative or a privation, it's an actual feeling, and although it may be an unpleasant or painful one, it's socially necessary and useful, unlike illness. As physical pain motivates avoiding things that cause it, so does sadness motivate avoiding things that cause it. It also promotes useful self-reflection and empathy and contributes to the grieving process and to healing. So feeling sad is something we're meant to do at appropriate times, to an appropriate degree, and so on. Even unpleasant operations, then, are fulfillments of some capacity in us. And it's even clearer that a pleasant operation, such as feeling joy, is a fulfillment of some sort. Now, I've been sticking to emotions as examples of operation, but there are other operations too. Willing is not an emotion, but an act of will, and it's also an operation. Still, that's also an appetitive act, and there are other types of operations besides appetitive ones. There are, for example, cognitive ones. But I've steered away from those for now since I'm trying to explain the general difference between motion and operation before applying that distinction to the case of cognitive acts. So to sum up the fourth difference between motion and operation in the words of Aquinas, operation does not cause the thing operating to become distant from its former condition, but perfects it, whereas in motion there has to be a departure from the thing's previous condition. Motion, then, has these characteristics. It's an act of an imperfect thing. It's also inherently an imperfect act, becoming progressively more complete while it's ongoing and ceasing to exist the moment it's complete. It has no nature of its own over and above the nature of the terminus that defines the motion, and it necessarily involves a departure from the contrary of the motion's object or terminus, hence a loss of some previous condition that the mobile subject was in. An operation, on the other hand, has all the opposite characteristics. It's an act of something perfect, meaning it isn't by its very definition the act of a thing becoming somehow more and more complete while the operation endures. It's also an inherently perfect act, being like a standing condition or state rather than like a progression. Its nature is not determined entirely by that of its object, but also by that of its subject, and it doesn't involve a departure from the contrary of its object. There you have it. Aquinas' distinction between motion and operation. So now we've looked at one way Aquinas and Aristotle distinguish acts. Some acts are motions, others are operations without being motions in the strict sense. Another way these philosophers classify acts is as transitive or immanent. And that distinction is our next step toward understanding Aquinas' doctrine of what we're doing when we know. Transitive actions are defined by producing or affecting some object external to the agent and its power. Heating and building are examples. When fire heats water, it's the fire doing the heating, but the thing affected is something else, the water. That's a transitive action. When a builder builds a house, it's the builder who acts, but the thing being built is something else, the house, which comes to exist in the house materials, not in the builder. That's also a transitive action. From these examples, we see that a transitive action can be a motion. Heating is a motion, building is a motion, and both are transitive by nature. They're called transitive because the action passes over from the agent to some external effect. The word transitive comes from the Latin preposition trans, meaning across, beyond, over, which we also see in words like transfer, transport, translate, and the verb ire, meaning to go. So an action is transitive if it goes over to something beyond the agent. In contrast, we have what Thomistic philosophers call immanent actions. Now, just in case my pronunciation or the context don't make it clear, let me stress, the term here is immanent with an A in the middle, not imminent with an I, and not eminent with an E. The word comes from the Latin verb immaneo, meaning to remain within. As that suggests, an action is immanent if it remains within the active power performing it and is not defined by perfecting some object or material outside that power. For example, if I desire to go home, my desire remains within my power of feeling desire. It doesn't do anything to my home, and by itself, it can't even cause me to go home. I can succeed in desiring to go home even if I have no way to get there, even if I never try. The desire is a perfectly successful act of desire just by existing in me, the desirer, regardless of whether it leads to anything beyond itself. And it certainly is not defined by some effect it has on the object I desire. It's accidental to a transitive action if it brings with it some actuality within the agent. But for an immanent action, that's essential. Immanent action consists in or causes some perfection or fulfillment of the agent itself. Being sad, for example, is an immanent action. My being sad doesn't consist in affecting anything beyond myself. I can succeed in being sad even if it has no effect on what I'm sad about. And as I mentioned earlier, being sad fulfills or exercises my capacity to feel sadness. It's a kind of perfection or completion of something in me, even if it's not a pleasant one. So the first and principal difference between transitive and immanent action is this. Transitive action is defined by producing an effect on something outside the agent. Any effect within the agent is accidental to its being transitive. Immanent action is defined the opposite way. It's essentially a perfection of the agent itself and is not defined or completed by any effect it may produce outside. There's another difference. An immanent action cannot be a motion. That might not be immediately obvious. If I'm walking home, the power producing the walking is in me, and the act of walking remains in me. So isn't that both a motion and a case of immanent action? No, and here's why. Even in a self-mover like you or me, there's still a difference between what's actively causing the motion and what the motion exists in. One portion of me is the motive part actively producing the motion. Another portion is the mobile part passively receiving the motion. For example, a muscle or tendon acts on a bone and moves it. So it's not the whole arm that moves itself in a single undivided way. One part acts on and moves another part. Now, seeing that every corporeal thing that moves itself must really consist of a motive part and a distinct mobile part is a subtle point, one requiring proofs beyond our scope here. But it's an intelligible idea. And it's this possibility of analyzing every bodily self-mover into distinct movers and mobiles that explains why self-motion is not really immanent action. It's still fundamentally transitive. One thing acts on another, even if they're connected parts of a single being. So to sum up, transitive action is defined by producing or affecting an object external to the agent, and it can be a motion. Immanent action is not defined by producing or affecting any object external to the agent, but by perfecting or fulfilling the agent's own power, and it never consists in a motion. And that's Aquinas' distinction between transitive and immanent action. Our next step is to see that knowing, what Aquinas calls cognoscere, is an immanent operation. It's clearly some kind of act or action. Of course, there is a sense in which know can mean not an action, but something like a habit, an acquired knowledge that lies dormant in us when not in use. For instance, even when Einstein was asleep, people would have said, that guy knows his physics, not meaning he's actively performing some act of knowing physics at that moment, but that he has a habitual knowledge he can call up and use at will when awake. But the only reason a cognitive habit can even be called knowing is that it's able to be put to use in an act of knowing. And it's that act that we want to define with Aquinas' help. When Einstein is actually thinking about general relativity, working through a problem or understanding and appreciating some solution, that's clearly an act or operation of his mind. But what sort of act is it? Is it a motion or is it an operation? And is it transitive or immanent? Understanding, sensing, imagining any cognitive act is, as Aquinas says, an operation, not a motion. Why? Well, remember, motion is the act of something incomplete or imperfect. It's an imperfect act with no nature of its own apart from its terminus, its endpoint, and it necessarily involves a departure from or a loss of the opposite of that terminus. Operations, by contrast, have the opposite features. Well, let's apply that to cognitive acts. Say you're seeing the color green. Does that imply you'll soon be seeing green more completely? Or that you'll become more green in the next moment? Nope. Seeing green is not like entering a room, which does imply that you'll soon be a little more inside the room than you are in the present instant. The same applies to remembering, imagining, understanding. None of these acts imply that you're progressively becoming something more complete or closer to some endpoint. That's sign number one. Cognitive acts are not motions, but operations. Here's another sign. Motion, by nature, is incomplete. If water is coming to a boil, it's not yet true that it has come to a boil. You can't say that water has spent 2 minutes coming to a boil and also say that after the first minute it has boiled. The moment you can speak of a motion as something you've done, the motion's over. But cognitive actions don't work like that. If you see someone sitting in a chair, you're seeing them sitting all at once. You don't have to wait 2 minutes and only then say you've seen them sitting. You can say both at once. You are seeing and you have seen. That's sign number two. Cognitive acts are complete, perfect acts, not inherently imperfect like motion. A third sign. A motion has no nature of its own apart from the terminus that specifies it. Getting hotter is nothing more than being imperfectly hot along an ordered continuum. But cognitive acts do or can involve some nature other than that of the object that specifies them. Even if you say that seeing a stone is an imperfect way of being that stone, it's still an act that essentially belongs to a visual power or a certain organ, with its own nature apart from the stone. A human act of seeing a stone definitely involves the stone, but its definition also has to include the visual portion of the human brain. And it differs from a canine act of seeing the same stone. Unlike a motion, then, a cognitive action has something like a dual nature, one that's due in part to its object and in part to its subject. Maybe the nature of the cognitive act can, in some very special cases, be entirely the same as the nature of its object, but these are exceptions that prove the rule. For example, maybe I can understand my own act of understanding. In that case, both the act and the object share the very same nature. Each is an act of understanding. But that's just accidental. It's because what I chose to understand happened to be the act of understanding and not something else. So in unusual cases like that, an operation may happen to share the very same nature as its object without qualification. But motion necessarily involves no nature beyond that of its terminus. Cognitive action is not like that. That's sign number three. Cognitive acts are operations, not motions. Now a fourth sign. Motion involves a departure from or a loss of the opposite of its terminus. Getting hotter requires moving away from coolness. Getting straightened out requires moving away from crookedness. But cognitive acts aren't like that. Yes, when you sense warmth, the object may warm you up a little. But that physical warming is not the same as your sensation of warmth. If you're in a coma, you might be physically warmed up, but you won't feel anything. If your nerves are blocked, no sensation arises, even if your hand heats up. The sensation itself is completed in the brain. And if your brain heats up slightly during that activity, that's just a side effect of blood flow or neural work. It also happens when you sense cold. Aside from this case, which is not a real exception, it's fairly plain that cognitive acts involve no departure from or loss of their object's contrary. When you understand sickness, you don't lose a little bit of health, or even a little bit of your understanding of health. In fact, the more you understand sickness, the better you understand health, and vice versa. Just by sensing, imagining, understanding, or in general knowing one of two opposites, you don't move away from the other one. That's sign number 4. Cognitive acts are operations, not motions. For these reasons, Aquinas says cognitive acts are operations and denies that they're motions, or says they're called motions only improperly, or in a broad, loose sense, because they don't exhibit all the defining characteristics of motion. For instance, he notes that the act of seeing colors and shapes is not like an alteration to a new color or shape, since seeing those things does not result from physically changing to the colors or shapes that one sees, but from receiving those aspects of things in some other way. He says acts of sensing are called motions minus propriae, less properly, not in the strict sense. Acts of the intellect, he adds, can be called motions only metaphorically. So, for these 4 reasons, cognitive acts are operations, not motions, at least not motions in a fully proper non-metaphorical sense. That's not to deny that many motions and physical processes underlie, prepare, or maintain cognitive acts. Human vision depends on countless physical processes, but vision itself is not a process in the same way. Homeostasis, to take an analogy, is not a process but a stable equilibrium, though it requires balanced processes to sustain it. Holding a posture isn't a process either, but a way of standing still, even though, again, it depends on numerous internal processes. Cognitive acts, especially acts of sensation, are similar. They depend on many physical motions or processes, but in themselves, they're operations. Aquinas also classifies cognitive acts not just as operations, but specifically as immanent operations, not transitive ones. Remember, a transitive operation is defined by affecting or producing something outside the active power, like building or heating. But when you see, remember, imagine, or understand something, your act does nothing to the object itself. Seeing something doesn't mean doing anything to it. Remembering can't affect the thing remembered since it exists only in the past. These acts are completed entirely within your vision, memory, imagination, or understanding. That's reason number 1 to say cognitive acts are immanent, not transitive. And second, it's not essential to transitive action that it perfect or complete the agent. If I build a house, the defining result is the house, not me or anything in me. Sure, I might get tired, but that's accidental, a side effect of expending energy or moving tools. Building is not defined as the act of making the builder tired. By contrast, an immanent action is defined as a perfection or fulfillment within the agent. When you see, hear, imagine, or understand, you complete or perfect something in yourself. If your act of understanding didn't bring anything about in you, but only in some external object, then you wouldn't become any wiser for understanding. Your education would only benefit something outside you. So if someone stole that external object, you'd lose the fruits of your education. That's clearly absurd. So that's reason number 2 for concluding that cognitive acts are immanent in their nature. Accordingly, Aquinas routinely lists cognitive acts alongside appetitive ones like willing as examples of immanent operations. As he says, there are 2 types of action. One type passes over to an external material, such as heating or cutting. The other remains within the agent, for example, understanding, sensing, and willing. The difference between these is that the first type of action is the perfection not of the agent that is moving something, but of the very thing moved, while the second action is the perfection of the agent. Now we've nailed down the nature of an act of knowing in a general way. It's an immanent operation. So far, we've taken 5 steps toward building a definition of know, or cognoscere, with Aquinas' help. We've gotten familiar with his terminology, acts, powers, and objects. We've learned his basic rules about agency. We've noted his distinction between motion and operation, and also between immanent and transitive action. Finally, we've seen that a cognitive action is neither motion nor transitive. It's an immanent operation. Next, we'll see that all knowledge or cognition depends on some form or representation, likeness, or assimilation. In Aquinas' own words, all knowledge is by means of a likeness. All knowledge is through an assimilation. More specifically, every cognitive act happens because some likeness or representation of its object is present in the cognitive power. In other words, for a cognitive power to be actual and fully able to act, it must actually possess some representation of the object it's going to know. Take the intellect, for example. Aquinas says, the intellect becomes actual through the fact that the thing understood exists in the intellect by means of its likeness. So understanding takes place through an assimilation of the one understanding to that which is understood. He says the same is true for sensory cognition. A sense power begins operating once some representation of the sensible object forms in it. As he puts it, a sense power, after it's been made actual by a sensible object, is like it, although before that it's not like it. So every cognitive action presupposes that the cognitive power holds a representation of the object to be known. There are a couple of ways to see this for ourselves. One way is inductive. For example, if you press gently near the outsides of your eyes, it looks like all the objects in your visual field are shifting around. Of course, the objects themselves aren't moving at all. That means the visual forms you see moving aren't the objects themselves, they're just representations of them in your vision. If you go cross-eyed, you see two of everything. But there aren't really two of everything, just two visual representations of everything being formed in your vision. So external sense, or at least vision, seems to work by forming representations of things through which to sense them. Imagination and memory provide even clearer cases. Even if there's no hamburger in front of you, you can still remember or imagine one. Not just how it looks, but also how it smells and tastes. Those colors, smells, and flavors aren't physically present, but you can call up images or representations of them in your mind. Intellectual knowledge works in the same way. When you think about something, you form an idea or a concept of it that's distinct from the thing itself, but somehow resembles it. Through that idea, you think of the thing represented. Your idea of a cat, for example, is definitely not a cat, but it resembles a cat, insofar as your idea comprises a cat's essential characteristics of being an animal, a quadruped, a carnivore, and so on. And so you can call up this idea anytime you want, which is why you can think of a cat even when there isn't one around. And you can't think of a cat without first forming some idea of one. That's a quick sketch of an inductive approach to Aquinas' claim that all knowledge happens by means of a likeness of the object being present in the knower. He also supplies us with the premises for a deductive approach, which we can sum up like this. Premise 1. If X becomes actual through being acted on by Y, then X is actual by becoming like Y. Premise 2. Our cognitive powers become actual through being acted on by their objects. Therefore, our cognitive powers are actual by becoming like their objects. Premise 1 comes from Aquinas' rule about agents, which we looked at in part 3 of this video. Remember the corollary, every agent produces something like itself in some way. That means when Y acts on X to make it actual, Y does this by giving X something like what Y itself has, some share or participation in its own actuality. This is what agents do in transitive actions, which is what we mean when we say Y acts on X. For example, when a builder turns building materials into a house, those materials become an actual house because they now have a form resembling the builder's plan. Likewise, when an acorn grows into an oak tree through genetic influence, the oak tree's form reflects the genetic information originally present in the acorn. So generally, if X becomes actual by being acted on or changed by Y, it does so by becoming somehow like Y. That's premise 1. Premise 2 points out that all our cognitive powers, like sense, imagination, memory, and intellect, are initially activated by their objects. This is especially clear with the senses. We can't see unless light reflected from things acts on our eyes, and we can't hear unless sound waves actually reach and affect our ears. Hence, Aquinas said sensing is a way of being acted on by sensible objects. But it's not just the external senses. Even internal powers like imagination and intellect, which can work without objects physically present, can't begin operating for the first time without their primary objects somehow acting on them. For example, our memory of an event is caused by that event. Our mental image of a cat, even if we can now summon it at will, originally comes from cats or pictures of them. So, following Aristotle, Aquinas said that understanding, in a way analogous to sense, is a way of being acted on, namely by intelligible objects. True, I can think of the definition of a sphere or of gold, even when such things are not physically present, but I only formed those ideas because I previously sensed or imagined spheres or gold or encountered representations of them. Of course, I can combine ideas I already possess in order to form a new idea of something I've never encountered, but I can't produce my primary concepts that way. So my primary acts of understanding must result from the objects themselves impinging on me via sense experience and the acts of my imagination and the like. And all my ideas formed by combining prior concepts depend on my primary ideas, hence ultimately on my mind being actualized by encounters with real objects. In short, all our cognitive powers are initially activated by their objects, and all our cognitive acts depend on what our powers gained by that initial impression made by their objects. And that's premise 2. So Aquinas concludes that every cognitive act, every act of knowing results from a likeness of the object being present in the cognitive power. As a side note, he also concluded, for reasons we won't cover here, that both angelic and divine cognition fit this pattern too. Even though God and his angels have cognitive powers that are always actual and don't need to be made actual by being acted on, they too operate by possessing likenesses of their objects. But for us, our cognitive acts are consequences of coming to possess some likeness of the objects. 3 quick clarifications will help avoid misunderstandings of Aquinas' doctrine here. First, the likeness of the object within a cognitive power must represent the object and the features of it to be known, but it doesn't have to be an actual instance of that object. For example, when I see a stone, there's a visual representation of it in my sight, but that representation obviously isn't itself a stone. It's just a likeness compatible with my sense of sight, something that can exist there, unlike the stone itself. Aquinas often says this likeness required for knowing is not a natural likeness in the usual sense. The nature of a stone does not, in fact cannot, exist in a cognitive power with the same natural existence it has in the stone. Instead, what knowledge requires is a representation. The object is present in the knower's cognitive power through a likeness that fits that power's nature. In that way, it's like a bronze statue of a horse, which captures something of its form. But that form exists in the bronze quite differently from the way it exists in the horse itself. So Aquinas doesn't say that the cause of knowledge is the object existing in the power with its own natural existence, the object's own natural existence. Rather, the cause is the likeness, the representation or species, as he would say, of the object in the cognitive power. The Latin word species has many meanings, and the one in play here is image or likeness. Hence Aquinas, following Aristotle, says the stone is not in the soul that knows a stone, but its species, its species, that is, its representation, is in the soul that knows a stone. A second point of clarification. Aquinas' conclusion applies to objects known of themselves, that is, things known per se. It doesn't apply to objects known not of themselves, but only through or in knowing something else. For example, we can see that a glass vase is transparent, though not by seeing the transparency itself, but only in seeing the colors of other objects through it. Thus, our vision doesn't see transparency just in itself. Accordingly, our vision doesn't represent transparency itself either, but only the colors it sees through the transparent object. Whenever we know something indirectly like that, our cognitive power knows it not through a representation of it, but through representations of other things. Now, a third and final clarification regarding Aquinas' principle that what makes a cognitive power actual is its possession of some likeness of its object. It might seem that Aquinas means we first form an internal representation, then we know that representation directly, and then we infer the external object that it resembles. But he denies that. For Aquinas, the very first things we know are not our own internal representations, our impressions or ideas, but the actual external things. People, cats, trees, clouds. When you look around, the first things you notice and pay attention to are the things outside you, not your visual images of them. You have to be made aware of those images before you even notice them. And you might even need to be convinced that you have such images in yourself at all. So our cognitive representations are not the primary objects we know, but the means by which we know the primary objects of our knowledge. Aquinas compares cognitive representations to heat in a fire. By the heat within itself, which is a likeness of the heat it will produce in another thing, the fire heats that thing, not its own heat. Likewise, the representation inside a cognitive power causes us to know the object it represents, not the representation itself. Our representations direct us immediately to their objects. That's not to say we can't reflect later on the fact that we must have cognitive representations by which we know things and then focus our attention on them. It's exactly what we're doing here by looking at Aquinas' reasons for saying that cognitive acts come from internal likenesses of objects. But the key point is we don't know those representations first. We come to know them only after we know the things they represent. Aquinas would also acknowledge that sometimes we deliberately form representations, whether external ones like statues, drawings, and photos, or ones within our minds such as stories and scientific models. And in those cases, we can know the representation first, and then through it come to know what it represents. But our naturally, automatically, unconsciously formed cognitive representations aren't like that. They immediately direct us to the objects they represent, and if we notice them at all, it's only after knowing those objects and reflecting on how we must have something within us that makes knowing them possible. Having gone through the basic steps toward Aquinas' understanding of what knowing is, we're now ready to put together a definition. Aquinas often defined things by combining their genus with some number of species-making differences. Here, genus and species don't have their biological meanings, but their philosophical ones. A genus is just a general kind of thing in relation to a more particular kind. For example, quadrilateral is a genus compared to square, and square is a species of quadrilateral. Likewise, horse is a species of animal, and animal is a genus compared to horse. Since many species exist under one genus, each species has to differ from the others by certain essential differences that define it. Horses differ from some animals by being quadrupeds, and from some quadrupeds by being herbivorous grazers, or social herd animals, and so on. Squares differ from some quadrilaterals by being equilateral, and from others by being right-angled. When you put together enough essential differences, you show how the thing essentially differs from all others under its genus, and that forms its definition. For instance, a square is an equilateral, right-angled quadrilateral. Let's apply that method to the thing called knowing, or what Aquinas calls cognoscere. Its genus is act, or more specifically, operation. As we saw in Part 4, acts are either motions or operations, and in Part 6 we saw why Aquinas classifies cognitive acts as operations, not motions. Aquinas also distinguished operations into immanent and transitive ones, as we covered in Part 5. And again in Part 6, we saw why cognitive acts must be immanent, not transitive. That's one key difference distinguishing cognitive acts from many other operations. They're immanent in nature. By applying Aquinas' basic rule of agency from Part 3 of this video, we saw in Part 7 that the act of knowing results from the presence of the object's form or representation in the corresponding cognitive power. That fact gives us the final difference needed to define the act of knowing and separate it from all other acts. So here's the definition we can put together. Knowing, or cognoscere, is an immanent operation that immediately results from the object's representation being in the agent. This is like saying that heating is a transitive operation resulting from heat being in the agent, or cutting is a transitive operation resulting from sharpness in the agent. It's a definition based on what formally constitutes the agent capable of the act, making it actual in the special way required for action. So that's the definition. To know X means to perform an immanent operation that results from the presence of a representation of X within the agent. We can also say something about what kind of being is capable of performing such an act. What sort of being is a cognitive being? Since it must perform an immanent operation by means of the form of another thing represented within it, then a cognitive being must be able to use the forms of other things to perform its own proper operation, namely knowing. And that's exactly what Aquinas says separates knowers from non-knowers, or cognitive beings from non-cognitive ones. Cognitive things, he says, are distinguished from non-cognitive ones in this, that non-cognitive ones have none but their own form alone, whereas a cognitive thing is capable of possessing the form of another thing as well, since the species or representation of the thing known is in the knower. Beings incapable of cognition, with zero knowledge or awareness, do whatever they do by means of their own forms and qualities alone, not by the forms of other things. Certainly, they don't perform any immanent operation by means of the forms of other things. When fire heats water, it does so by its own heat, not the heat of anything else. And even when the water in turn heats an egg after receiving heat from the fire, it heats the egg with its own heat, not the fire's heat. Some non-cognitive things can, in a loose sense, act by means of the forms of other things, but only in a loose sense, and only to perform transitive actions. A statue of Plato, for example, performs an action of sorts because it makes an impression on the vision of passers-by, and it does this by possessing the form of another thing, namely Plato. But as far as the bronze is concerned, that shape is just the shape it has. It doesn't refer that shape to Plato in any way. Only we do that. Also, that action is transitive, not immanent. The statue acts on the vision of others. It does not perform an act that remains within the statue itself with Plato as its object. Phew. Wow, we've reached the first major goal of this video, defining knowing or cognitive action, according to Aquinas' cognitive philosophy. Our next major goal is to distinguish certain types of cognitive acts, especially thinking and understanding, to sharpen our question about whether AI can truly think and understand. As you might expect, Aquinas recognizes many different kinds of cognitive acts. One way he distinguishes these acts, even when their object is the same, is by the different powers performing them. For example, seeing and feeling the shape of a wooden block are different cognitive acts, even though the object is the same, because one is an act of sight and the other an act of touch. Another way he distinguishes cognitive acts, even when the power performing them is the same, is by the different objects of those acts. Seeing green differs from seeing blue, for instance, since the objects green and blue are different and incompatible. The same part of vision can't perceive both at once. A third way Aquinas distinguishes cognitive acts, even when the same power performs both and both acts share the same object, is by different degrees of perfection in the acts. For example, merely suspecting that every integer has a unique prime factorization and understanding why every integer has a unique prime factorization are both acts of the same cognitive power, the mind, and both concern the same object too, namely that statement about integers. Yet they're not the same act, because one is imperfect and the other perfect. Keeping these different ways of distinguishing cognitive acts in mind, let's now single out some specific ones Aquinas highlights. Of course, there are many cognitive acts we could discuss. To keep things manageable, let's focus on sensing, understanding, and thinking, or, in Aquinas' Latin, sentire, intelligere, and cogitare. Both sensing and thinking contrast with understanding, but in different ways. Sensing differs from understanding because they're performed by different powers and have different objects. Thinking differs from understanding as an imperfect act differs from a perfect act of the same power. Let's start by contrasting sensing and understanding, then move on to thinking and understanding. As I mentioned earlier, Aquinas distinguishes sensing and understanding primarily by their objects. Sensing is an act of knowing particulars, individual things, while understanding is an act of knowing universals. For example, by sight, we can see the color of this or that horse, and by touch, feel the texture of an individual horse's coat. But we cannot sense color itself in general, apart from any particular color, nor can we sense what a horse is apart from any particular horse. Nor can we know by sensation the truth of the statement, every integer has a unique prime factorization. We know those universals not by sensing with our five senses, but by understanding. That said, I should explain that I'm using sensing and understanding in their primary and specific senses. Both words have many meanings, and it's not true across all their meanings that sensing is only of individuals, not universals, or that understanding is only of universals, not individuals. Take sensing first. The English word, like the Latin sentire, means more than one thing. When I say eyesight senses the colors of things, to sense means to perceive through one of the 5 external senses. But if I say I sense there's something wrong with an argument or definition, to sense means to have an uncertain idea in mind, an intellectual inkling, not an act of any of the 5 senses. So sometimes sense means an act performed through our external senses, and other times an act performed by the intellect. When used in that extended sense, it's fine to say that we can sense or get a sense of something universal, like a universal truth or falsehood. But it remains true that sensing by our 5 senses is always a cognitive act of individual things, never of universals as such. And to sense with our 5 senses is sensing in the primary sense of sense. I think that made sense. Much the same applies in the words understand in English and intelligere in Latin. Both have multiple meanings, and according to at least one of those, understand means knowing something individual. For example, I understand why you're sad, or why you're angry, or why you're saying or doing something. That's understanding an individual person, not something universal. However, we also say we understand universal things in universal truths. We understand, for instance, what a cat is, or what a circle is, and that every cat is a mammal, or that every circle can have a square inscribed in it. So when taken in that sense, understanding always refers to knowing universals, never individuals as such. For reasons we won't get into here, Aquinas holds that the same human power cannot know both individuals as such and universals as such. If he's right, then even if we use the same word understand sometimes to mean grasping individuals and other times universals, we're still talking about 2 different acts performed by 2 different cognitive powers in us. And for our purposes, the power I'm focusing on when I say understand is the one that apprehends universals. Now we can see what Aquinas means when he says, in us, sense knowledge, which is of individual things, precedes the intellect's knowledge, which is of universals. Sensing differs from understanding in that sensing is of particulars, understanding is of universals, sensing is an act of a sense power, while understanding is an act of the mind or intellect. So that covers the distinction between sensing and understanding according to Aquinas. The distinction between thinking and understanding is different. Both thinking and understanding belong to the same power, the intellect, and they can refer to the very same object as well. For example, I can think that it's impossible to circumscribe a rhombus with a circle before I truly understand that and know why it's impossible. But both acts, thinking it's so and understanding why it's so, happen by the same power in me. First, with my intellect, I think the statement is true, and later, again with my intellect, I understand why it's true. Before we explore the basic contrast between thinking and understanding, let's note that, like sense and understand, the word think has several meanings in English, at least as many as its Latin counterpart cogitare. Aquinas distinguishes 3 meanings of cogitare, and since our word think covers those same 3, we can translate what he says about cogitare using think. Here's what he says. To think can be taken in 3 senses. In one sense, it means generally any active consideration of the intellect. In another sense, to think means more strictly a consideration of the intellect which occurs along with some investigation before the intellect reaches full certainty. In a third sense, it means the act of the cogitative power. These 3 meanings of think hold in English too. First, it can mean any act of the intellect at all, whether in that act you understand clearly and correctly, or unclearly, or even incorrectly, or are still making mental efforts to understand. For example, you already know what a circle is, and you can think about that anytime you want. Also, you know there are infinitely many prime numbers, so you rightly think that's true. But maybe I'm not familiar with number theory, so I think there's a greatest prime number, and I'm wrong. That's one meaning of think, to actively consider in any way any universal kind of thing or any universal truth or falsehood. Second, think can mean an act of the intellect engaged in trying to understand something. For example, if you're my teacher and you've given me all the information I need to answer a question, but I still don't know the answer, you might say, think. You're not saying understand exactly, but rather reason, work it out, use your mind to investigate. We often say we're still thinking about something. That phrase evokes the image of moving around an object mentally before zeroing in on its essence and really understanding it, or looking at something from all sides before seeing what the right course of action is and making a firm decision. We also say we've thought it out or thought it through, which implies having reached a mental finish line, a full understanding of something, as opposed to when we're still thinking about it. In both this second sense and the first sense of think mentioned a moment ago, we're talking about acts of the intellect. The difference is that the first sense means any act of the intellect, while the second more specifically refers to an investigative effort, thinking as trying to figure out something not yet fully understood. In a third sense, think can mean an act of a different power, not the intellect that grasps universals, but an internal sense power that Aquinas calls the cogitative power. Sometimes he calls it particular reason to contrast it with universal reason, which is the intellect. This cogitative power is similar to the intellect because it performs analogous acts, only its objects are individual things, not universals. Unlike mere sensation, it can make inferences and form judgments and apprehend things that go beyond the 5 external senses. So it's like reason and like an intellect in those ways. For example, if a police officer pulls me over and judges that I'm intoxicated based on my bloodshot eyes and slurred speech, he's using his cogitative power. He cannot directly see or even smell intoxication itself. So his judgment is not pure sensation, but an inference from signs. That's cogitation, an act of the cogitative power drawing an inference or making a judgment. And in plain English, we say the officer thinks I'm drunk. Of these 3 senses of think or cogitare, let's focus on the second, the act of thinking as trying to reason something out, figure it out, or think it through. In this sense, thinking is to understanding as something imperfect is to something perfect, or as incomplete is to complete. Aquinas explains the difference this way. Reasoning is related to understanding as moving is to resting, or as acquiring is to having. One is the act of something perfect, the other of something imperfect. Just as rest comes before and after motion, so understanding comes before and after reasoning. Before reasoning, I have a certain natural understanding from experience, say of self-evident principles like the whole is greater than the part. After reasoning from such principles, I gain a reasoned understanding, as in mathematics or philosophy. It's important to stress this is only an analogy. Aquinas doesn't say reasoning or thinking literally is motion, but it's like motion or a process relative to understanding. Just as motion terminates at a new location, reasoning terminates in a new understanding. Thinking also involves discrete steps and can be quick, similar to running around or through something. The English word discourse, which means reasoning, comes from Latin discurrere, which means to run to and fro, run through, run around. Still, these similarities don't mean thinking is a motion in the strict sense. Aquinas insists that no real motion exists in intellectual acts except metaphorically. This is because thinking is an immanent operation, not a motion in place. And thinking consists of discrete steps, not continuous flow. And again, because all steps must be retained in reasoning. Unlike walking or running, where previous steps must be left behind in order to reach the goal, forgetting any step in reasoning means never reaching the conclusion. For these reasons, Aquinas, like Aristotle, actually says that reasoning and syllogizing are more like rest than like motion. To sum up, sensing, thinking, and understanding all name cognitive acts. Sensing and understanding belong to different powers, sense and intellect, and differ in that sense apprehends particulars, while intellect apprehends universals. Thinking and understanding, when thinking means the investigative act of the intellect, are acts of the same power. But they differ in that thinking is like a movement from one understanding to another, analogous to motion from rest to rest. We've now seen how Aquinas defines knowing or cognitive act in general and how he distinguishes some of its particular kinds. These fundamentals of his cognitive philosophy will serve us well when we construct Thomistic arguments about artificial intelligence in videos 8 and 9. For now, our task is to see how Aquinas' definitions and distinctions help refine and sharpen our question about AI. When I talk about truly sensing, thinking, or understanding, I'm referring specifically to the non-metaphorical senses of those words as defined by Aquinas. His definitions describe the general nature of the very acts of perceiving, thinking, and understanding that we perform, not other actions that somehow resemble or relate to such acts. We do often use cognitive terms figuratively or metaphorically as well. For example, we might say an old rifle has seen a lot of action, or that an ancient artifact saw the light of day after spending centuries underground. Obviously, these objects don't literally see. We say these things see either because we imagine them anthropomorphically or because we project our own visual experience onto their emergence into view. Other times, we apply cognitive terms metaphorically to things whose actions or reactions more closely resemble or relate to our own cognition. For instance, a thermometer might be said to sense the temperature in a room. That's still metaphorical, but the thermometer's function resembles our sense of touch. It responds automatically and proportionately to temperature changes and also informs us of the current temperature. Does that mean the thermometer really senses temperature as we do? That would require it to perform an immanent operation, not only to be changed internally by the temperature itself, but subsequently to perform within itself an operation as distinct from emotion, and there's no evidence of that, and no one really believes it. We say it senses because its behavior bears important similarities to our sensation, not because it genuinely performs the same kind of internal act. A thermostat might also be said to sense the temperature, and we might say it knows when it's too cold, so it tells the furnace to fire up. If the thermostat is part of a system with centralized control, I might not be able to adjust its setting, so I put a bag of ice on it. Then it thinks the room is colder than it really is and turns on the furnace for me. In this way, the thermostat senses, knows, and thinks. The thermostat is even more like us than the mere thermometer. Using the temperature information that it's registered and some internal representation of the desired temperature, it performs a task that we want done. We ourselves would accomplish the same by literally sensing the cold, understanding that we want warmth, and then acting to turn on the furnace. Since the thermostat carries out this task in our stead, using similar information, we naturally say it senses and knows. But does the thermostat really sense and know as we do? Again, that would mean it performs immanent operations. It would have an inner awareness like ours. And there's no evidence of that, and few people seriously think so. Most of us say the thermostat senses and knows simply because of the similarities between its behavior and our own, without dwelling on the important differences. To the extent that we're speaking in that manner, we're still using cognitive terms metaphorically. We don't mean to attribute to the thermostat any true immanent operations like those we experience ourselves. Something similar can be said about the spell check feature of a word processor. I might say spell check thinks I've misspelled a word, but then I add that word to its vocabulary, and now that it's learned the word, it understands that it's not a real misspelling. So it thinks, learns, and understands. Here too, most of us don't intend to attribute any inner awareness to the word processor. We just use the cognitive terms because its behavior resembles our own, and because the type of information it operates on is similar to what we would use if we performed its tasks ourselves. Now, I'm not suggesting these are all purely playful uses of language like saying a firearm sees active duty. Beyond charming our imagination, employing cognitive terms can be very helpful, convenient, even indispensable when describing what our devices do. But as long as we use these words to describe their behavior without meaning to attribute to them any immanent operation, we're speaking figuratively or metaphorically. This is because true cognitive acts are immanent operations, as we saw in part 6 of this video. That's the genus of action to which they belong, and it's an essential component of the general meaning of know or cognoscere. So if other sorts of actions aren't immanent operations, but we call them by cognitive names due to some other resemblance to such actions, for example because they have similar effects, then that's metaphorical, like calling something a lion because it resembles a lion in some way, though not in the essential way of being a certain type of cat. If we insist on using lion non-figuratively, then it applies only to the big cat. If we apply it to anything that's not a cat, hence to something missing at least one essential ingredient of being a lion in the first and proper sense, then that thing is a lion only metaphorically, and it doesn't have to be a cat or even an animal at all. The immanent nature of cognition is worth pausing on again. We saw why Aquinas classifies cognitive acts as operations, not motions, and as immanent, not transitive actions. But what about everything going on in our brains whenever we sense, think, or understand? Electrical and chemical signals travel through our brains, and those are motions. When one neuron fires and causes another to fire, that's transitive action. Aren't those actions involved in cognition too? Absolutely. But the acts we experience within ourselves, sensing, knowing, thinking, understanding, are all immanent operations, not motions or transitive actions as noted earlier. By contrast, the transitive actions and motions in our brains associated with these cognitive acts are things we cannot experience internally. We can only observe them externally, for example, with fMRI. Internally, those brain processes are automatic and unconscious. We're not aware of them. So they're not the same as the cognitive acts themselves, being things we cannot observe within ourselves by reflection, and being transitive actions and motions rather than immanent operations. They're somehow necessary for our cognitive acts, but they are something else, either precursors to them or the means by which they're supported and maintained. To highlight the difference, imagine two scenarios. I don't think either one is really possible, but they're imaginable, and they should help clarify the distinction between our cognitive acts and the brain's motions and transitive operations that our cognitive acts depend on. So scenario 1, your brain continues to function as usual, at least as far as anyone observing you from the outside can tell. But the inner you that you experience, all your sensations, emotions, acts of remembering, wondering, thinking, doubting, understanding, recognizing, imagining, that's vanished completely. Your internal awareness of yourself and the world is entirely gone. Your body, speech, and voluntary actions are controlled by fully automatic brain functions which you cannot experience any more than you can experience its autonomic regulatory processes. You don't feel, hear, see, think, or experience emotion. It's as if you're under perfect general anesthesia. In a sense, you've ceased to exist, leaving only the outer shell of you, yet your body continues performing tasks, going to work, holding conversations, making facial expressions, having dinner, and no one realizes that inside you're now just an unconscious zombie. That's scenario 1. Scenario 2 is the exact opposite. All cognitive centers in your brain stop functioning completely. All intercellular transmissions and all intracellular processes normally associated specifically with cognition, conscious appetition, and voluntary motor function have ceased. Yet somehow you continue to feel quite yourself. You hear, see, feel, experience emotion and thought, and move about as usual. Doctors observing your brain have no idea what to make of you. You're a walking impossibility. That's scenario 2. So in scenario 1, you retain all your brain activity but lose all your conscious experience and voluntary control, while in scenario 2, you retain all conscious experience and control but lose all the brain activity normally correlated with those things. Surely neither scenario is actually possible. But do you see the difference between them? If you do, then you see the difference between, on the one hand, what Aquinas calls acts of cognition proper, and on the other hand, the brain acts observable to external observers, but not experienced from within. What Aquinas calls acts of cognition are all those interior experiences you have directly in yourself, those acts that vanish in scenario 1. These are immanent operations, for the reasons given earlier in this video. So while they may presuppose, follow upon, and depend on transitive operations in the brain, they're nonetheless distinct from them. It's precisely these immanent operations that Aquinas calls cognition. In a secondary or extended sense, however, nothing prevents the associated motions and transitive operations of the brain from also being called cognitive acts. In the primary sense, a cognitive act means a particular immanent act itself, whether sensing, thinking, or understanding. But in a secondary sense, cognitive acts can refer to any acts dedicated to supporting those immanent operations, even if these supportive acts are transitive in nature and consist of motions or processes. These supportive acts may process information rapidly and automatically, thereby producing, improving, or maintaining certain cognitive representations, or species in Aquinas' terminology, by which we know things. But in this way, they're preparatory causes of cognitive actions in the primary sense. They're not themselves cognitive actions in the primary sense. In light of these considerations, our question about whether AI can truly think and understand now has a clearer meaning. The question is whether artificial intelligence can perceive, think, and understand in the primary and proper senses of these terms, which refer to immanent operations, or are those terms applied to AI only in a secondary or figurative sense? Does AI perform immanent operations that resemble ours, such that we say it thinks, understands, perceives, learns, experiences, feels, and imagines? Or are those attributions made only because AI performs certain transitive operations similar to those in our brain that serve cognition, enabling AI to perform tasks similar to those that we perform by means of our knowledge? If the first is true, then AI can truly think and understand. But if the second, then AI thinks and understands only in a secondary or figurative sense. Though on the metaphorical spectrum, its actions would admittedly resemble true cognition more than those of a thermostat or a spell checker. Now that we've refined our question, we're ready to begin exploring the answers. In the next video, we'll look at the main reasons why some say the answer is yes, and artificial intelligence can truly think and understand. See you there.